This week I'll be building a Stargate inspired portal that was also inspired by a piece of artwork that I found online. Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. I'm always looking for something original to build as a diorama or a piece of terrain to put down on my game table. And this week, while scrolling through Facebook, I came across this artwork from Nature Heaven. I really liked the composition of this artwork and it inspired me to build a floating Stargate style portal with a whole heap of nature and vines exploding through from the other dimension into ours. So I went to Bunnings and started to get some bits and pieces for the build. And happened to find this perfectly round MDF board which works brilliantly as a base. Now to start the portal, I grabbed out some foam board and something circular to trace out a nice base. Once I had this traced down in a perfect circle, I grabbed out a blade and cut this away. Then repeating this process with a small circle on the inside for our portal entryway. By using these two items as my guides, I can create more matching circles to make some more layers that all fit the same circumference. Now that we have a shape, it's time to add in some detail. I want this to look like it's been made of brick or stone by some ancient civilization. So I'll grab a pen and just start marking in my brick lines. Then using a blade to add some more detail to the edges, giving a little bit of a gap where the stones meet up. Before cleaning up the inside of the portal to give it a bit more of a natural stone edge. Then to build the stairs, I grabbed out a bigger piece of XPS foam and grabbed out my hot wire cutter, starting to carve out a selection of small steps that I can use to build my way up to this floating portal. This could easily be done with a knife, but I just love the satisfying feeling of the hot wire cutter. This one was just a cheap purchase from Amazon, but there are a lot better options out there, such as the Proxxon hot wire cutters. But for now, I'll have to stick with the cheap option. Once I was happy with my stair size, I started to pile them up and quickly realized that they wouldn't balance all too well. So I would have to add in some kind of support using a high gauge wire. So I pulled it out of the garage and trimmed off a healthy sized portion. And before gluing everything down, I decided to add in a bit more of a rocky texture to all of these steps. So I grabbed out a ball of aluminium foil and just started to press it against the foam, giving some nice indented texture. And repeating this process over all of the stone steps. Unfortunately, I didn't have any hot glue, which would have set so much quicker than this, but this expanding Gorilla Glue did a really good job, ultimately, of holding everything down, even if it took a while to set. Next up, I poked a hole through this base piece to work as an anchor for my support beam. Adding in a little bit of extra glue just to make sure that everything held nice and strong. Then repeating this process over all of my stairs, making sure that the wire that sat through the middle would help to hold everything nice and solid so this could be playable in game. At this point I started to use the hot end of the wire cutter to add some more stony effects onto the steps and give them a bit more of a fantasy feel. It's also just a really satisfying tool to use. Now, while giving those first few steps a bit of time to dry, I decided to add a few more layers onto the portal, making it a bit more solid, as well as giving it a bit more of a 3D effect. So I grabbed the same circular elements that I used earlier to make sure that the sizes all matched up, traced them out, and cut these to shape. But this time cutting that shape in half again, so that I could have one smaller and one larger circle to really bulk out that portal. Then giving it a quick dry fit before gluing this down. I'm also hoping that this is going to make it a bit more stable, as one thin layer of the foam board is likely to break, and that would be very frustrating after this entire build. So now that that's glued down, I'll cut in a few shapes for the bricks, and then roll over the entire thing with that aluminium foil in order to add some stony texture. And then cutting down one last piece of the foam core board to glue in place as a walkway to enter into the portal. This is still quite thin and brittle, so I gave it a quick layer of MogPodge to try and give it a bit more of a harder coat. Once this was dry, I got onto making the actual portal. I wanted to make this look something like Stargate, where it's a nice rippled water effect. So to start, I poured a whole heap of gloss Mod Podge into the original portal build. Very quickly after this, I realised that I still needed to paint the actual portal, and this would have been a bit of a pain. So once it was a little bit dried, I peeled the portal away, leaving me with the perfect size circle. This Mod Podge will dry perfectly clear and keep a nice rippled effect on top. So I weighed it down to keep it from blowing away and put it out in the sun to dry. We'll come back to that later on. But for now, I've added another ring to the back of the portal and a bit more of a thicker step onto that walkway entrance to help it blend in with the rest of the steps that I've already prepared and stacked further and further up that support beam. At this point in the build, I decided to carve in some small little lips on the bottom of the stairs to help them hold miniatures. But for now, it's time to add that top step and the portal onto this floating staircase. This time using hot glue, which is a much better solution while working with these foams as it dries significantly quicker and allows you to get on with the rest of the build. Now for the last few little details before adding in a layer of the Black Magic Craft Mod Podge and black paint mix to seal everything up. This is an incredibly important step as we're about to spray the entire thing with a grey spray paint. And if you don't have this stuff sealed up nicely, you're going to melt away all of your foam, which will destroy your build. And after all this time putting it together, there's nothing more frustrating. So, using the black paint mixed in with the Mod Podge, you can really make sure that you get into all of the gaps and get it nice and deep in those nooks and crannies. And while we're at this stage, we may as well hot glue down a few roughed up pieces of foam to act as some stones and extra debris to give that base a little bit more of an interesting shape. And then sealing those up as well before we take the whole thing outside to dry in the sun and give it a prime. I'll be using the same cheap grey primer that I use across basically everything that I get from my local Bunnings for a few bucks. And already with just a basic grey spritz, they're starting to come together as the nice stony walkway that I imagined.
A few moments later.
Once that was dry, it was time to add in a layer of Scult'a'mold to really give that natural base. And this right here is where I screwed up. I forgot to add in glue. This ended up leading to a massive issue later on where the entire thing peeled away. But of course I didn't realize this right away, so I went ahead and started to spread this over the entire base, building out my natural texture and even going as far as to go and pick some roots out of the garden and try and mix these in for a more natural feel. I love this effect as there's nothing more natural than nature. It's hard to make something look this good, and once you've given the whole thing a good sealant with glue, these are going to last a decent amount of time on your board. Trust me, I have things that have lasted well over a year that have been pulled out of the garden, as long as you soak them and seal them well enough. In this case, this is all going to get pulled up very shortly once I realise my mistake. But it looks pretty good. I even added a layer of a watered down Mod Podge and then spread a whole heap of dirt textures and smaller stones over the entire thing before leaving it overnight to dry. You'll see how well that turned out when I come back in the morning. So the next morning, once everything was dry, I pulled it off the baking paper to have a look at how well everything had stuck down. At this point, I was actually pretty happy. It didn't seem like there was any issues, so I went ahead with the inking stage to help add a deeper layer of details into the shadows and crevices. This is a simple DIY brown wash. I've shown you guys how to make this in a previous video, and I love using it to try and add a bit more depth to my builds. But in this case, I wanted it to be a bit more of a darker grey. So I added in a little bit more of my black ink and then continued to use this over all of the stonework, helping to add in a whole heap of extra shadows and details onto all of these grey rocks. And also using it over the entire base to add a whole new layer of depth to this natural environment, before coming back in with some toilet paper and dabbing away all of the excess. Then repeating this process over the portal itself, helping to bring out all of those cracks and details in between the brickwork and those textures that I work so hard to add. It was at this point that I noticed the base starting to crack away. As soon as a little bit of water had soaked in, that plaster mix that I had for my original basing just didn't hold up. This is why you need to make sure to add some kind of glue Otherwise, the whole thing just falls apart. This was incredibly frustrating. A few hours of work and a lot of detail had gone into this, and the whole thing was just peeling away. So I decided to bite the bullet and just carve away the entire thing and restart the entire basing process from scratch. This time making sure to add the glue into my Scult'a'mold mix. I may have even gone a little bit over top just because I didn't want to have to go through this process again. So once I had that mixed up, I did everything that I showed you before, this time with Scult'a'mold that actually works. Again, grabbing some more of those natural twigs and sticking them down. This time they stuck a lot better as there's actually glue mixed in. I should have picked that up on the first round. But I didn't, so second time's a charm. And then coming back in with some smaller pebbles and dirt textures to just add another layer to the nature. In my experience, the more variation there is on the board, the more natural the end result will look. And once that's dry, it's time to hit the whole thing again with that brown ink. This time when making the Scult'a'mold, I didn't mix any darker colours in, so I really had to soak in this brown ink to help give a really earthy dirt feel to the base. Now let's come back to that portal. The first layer dried really nicely. Once I peeled it off the baking paper, it looked exactly like the kind of effect that I was going for. But it felt a little bit flimsy, so I decided to thicken it up with some water effects by Vallejo. This dries perfectly clear and would hopefully give me a bit more of a solid base for my portal. So once I'd coated the entire thing, I ran a lighter over top to try and remove any excess bubbles and left the whole thing to dry.
Later that same evening.
And once again this dried looking great, but it was a little bit too smooth. So I came back in with another layer of the MogPodge, pouring this out, spreading it around, and then dappling it with my fingers to give me some variations to the height so that when it catches the light, it looks like rippled water. So the next part of this build that I really want to work on is making some vines that are pouring out of this portal, like some kind of otherworldly nature flowing through into our environment. So for this, I'm going to unwind some twine, pull it apart, and really work this into some vines. Once it's stripped back enough and looking nice and naturally random, it's time to take it outside and spray a few of these down with some quick grip glue. This glue will help to hold everything together and bunch it up into some nice natural looking vines. It also helps stick down a whole heap of flockings, which can work as some extra foliage and really sells the idea that these are living vines. I then did this a few more times to give myself a good sized collection of vines before again waiting for this to dry, which gave me the perfect opportunity to come in and start dry brushing a few extra colours onto the portal and the brickwork. I used a Karak stone around a couple of these edges of the portal to separate them from the other stonework, and then I dry brushed a cold grey over all of the stonework to really bring it to life and help it pop against the rest of the board. And now it was time to test out those vines. I threw down a few onto the portal to see what they roughly looked like pouring out of this portal base. But I just didn't like the plain, brighter brown colour of the string. It looked too obviously like string to me. So at this point I decided to soak the entire thing in my brown ink. One at a time, they got a good bath in the brown wash, and then I'd clean away any excess with a dabbing of toilet paper before leaving them all to dry for the night.
The following day.
And the next day, they were better than ever. The soaking had really given them a bit more of a dense feeling and allowed them to really take shape quite nicely. So I had a big pile of nice natural looking vines ready to attach to my portal. All that was needed was to cut back some of the excess string so that they would cut off perfectly at the portal stage. Then busting out the hot glue gun and sticking them down to make it look like they were pouring through the portal entryway. Once I had the base of the vines down, it was time to double check this portal. A little bit of the glue had seeped a little bit further out than I would have liked, so the portal needed a little bit of a trim down. Once I'd cut this to size, it was time for another test, and my god, this came together perfectly. It's given me the exact kind of look that I was hoping to get from this dried MogPodge. It looks beautiful. But before we glue it in, it's time to add a whole heap of nature to the base of this build. We're going to start off with a heap of matte MogPodge. I prefer to use the matte over the gloss in these cases so we don't get a shiny base pushing through all of our foliage. Then I'm going to add in a little bit of these brown dried dead wood effects before smothering the entire thing in a couple of different types of foam flocking. And repeating this process over the entire base. I really want this to look lush and overgrown, so I'm just going to keep on going until I'm satisfied with the end result. I always try and use at least 2 different types of flocking so you get a nice natural variation, because in nature nothing tends to be one perfect colour. Once the ground had a good covering, it was time to start moving these mosses up the sides of the build, bringing a bit more of a vertical element to the greenery by adding some glue and then just dabbing on the same flocks all the way up the stonework and in a few of the little cracks and crevices along my build. This really helps to make the whole thing look naturally grown in and like it's been there for a long time, and I couldn't have been happier with the end result. And since we're adding some more greenery to the structure, I decided to add another layer of vines, pouring in from higher up on the portal. I really want this to look like this other dimension is exploding through into our environment. Then coming in with some reindeer moss to add a few larger bushes and a whole heap of grass tufts and flowers. If you've seen any of my other builds, you know that I tend to go overboard at this point, and this build was no exception. This is probably the most tufts and flowers that I've ever used on one build, and it came together perfectly. I went out of my way to use as much variation as I possibly could, with lots of different colours and a few different styles of flowers that I haven't used in the past. I really wanted this to look like there was some kind of magical explosion of nature, as there's a whole heap of things coming through this portal that aren't usually seen in our world, and somehow it's causing everything to thrive. So, after going through most of my collection of tufts and flowers, it was time to add a bit more of an explosion coming out of the portal itself. I grabbed these pink flowers out that have a sticky base and tend to wrap around things nicely, and tried to set them up to look like they were really exploding out of the portal area. And once I was happy with the amount of life coming out of this area, it was time to grab the hot glue gun and stick that portal in place. And this couldn't have worked more perfectly. Those layers of dried MogPodge really gave me that rippled effect, giving a nice warp to anything you can see through the portal, while also catching the light in an amazing way to give us that Stargate rippled water feel. With a little bit more hot glue to hold everything in place nice and solid, this build was almost done. But before I can call it finished, I have to add a few more tiny 3D printed bits. So I'm going to paint up a handful of these mushrooms and some tiny frogs and critters to stick down amongst my explosion of wildlife, as well as a few of these monstera leaves, because I love me some hipster plants. All of these larger pieces of foliage are available over at my mini factory. I supported the Kickstarter, but they're all available for purchase individually or as a pack. The link to all of these models will be available in the description. And then all of these smaller mushrooms and critters are available for free on Thingiverse, and these are one of my favourite things to add to any build. And if you've watched any of my old videos, you know that I particularly love these tiny little frogs. So I'm going to have to stick a decent amount of them down into this build, as well as a few other little critters and a handful of creepy details, showing that this portal isn't just beautiful, it's also deadly. As usual, I was stoked with the end result of my build. The portal turned out perfectly with what I was hoping for, really giving me that Stargate style vibe with the way that it catches the light. And even a few friends of mine recognized it as a Stargate inspiration as soon as they saw it. The entire thing is an overboard attack of nature, and I'm really happy with how this looks in the end. It's going to look like a beautiful centerpiece on my table, as well as something great to sit on the shelf. I really hope you guys try this style out for your own kind of portals, or just take any kind of inspiration from this build whatsoever, including the idea of taking art pieces that inspire you and turning them into your own dioramas or set pieces. I love that I got to use a whole heap of new methods in this build, from the portal style itself to these new beautiful vines that are gonna find their place in a lot of my future builds. As well as getting back to all of those tiny bits and pieces that I've used in previous builds. Coming in with this Feywild explosion of nature really brings me back to some of my original builds and that style that I love to make. I really love it when people can look at my builds and always find something new, no matter how many times they've seen it in the past. That's the advantage of all these tiny little bits and pieces. Like I mentioned, all of these models will be linked in the description if you'd like to try this yourself, and I would love to see your end results. So please share your work. I have a Facebook group and an Instagram, as well as a few other methods of contact in the description. If there's anything else you'd like to see, let me know in the comments below. I would love to see you as a new subscriber on the channel. Until next time, never stop making stuff.